All right. We're ready to go and start this webinar. Thank you for everyone who has joined us. If you joined a little bit later, you can always watch the video. I'll give reminders throughout the webinar. This webinar is called Navigating Shipping and Logistics when Exporting. It's a great and very popular topic because once you go ahead and find your partners and your buyers and you price your product and you now you have a sale, now you want to ship your products abroad. And this webinar is going to teach you exactly how to do it and give you some good basics. So once again, my name is Victoria Wasike, President and CEO of Golden Crest Global. I'll give you a very brief overview about myself. If you have not participated in the previous webinars, they are previously recorded. You can see more about myself. Then I'm going to just do it very briefly for purposes of time today. We're going to cover a lot. So previous experience, trade manager for the state of Iowa, focusing mainly on Asia, manager of international business development for the state of Iowa, focused on foreign direct investment. I am a lawyer by trade or training. I practice for Denton's Davis Brown. It was Davis Brown Law Firm in their international and litigation divisions. Manage activities for offices for the state of Iowa and Europe, Japan, China, Taiwan, and Mexico. I did quite a few trade missions, still doing trade missions. We just did a trade mission for a client to Asia and South Korea in April. So doing those all the time, but did governor-led trade missions for the state of Iowa. And then, of course, appointed for different appointments for the EU and also for Japan. I presented different conferences and events throughout Europe, Asia, and then, of course, a lot domestically. Adjunct professor for Drake University Law School and College of Business. And that's why I love teaching so much. And then, of course, I have a master's in public policy from George Mason, and I was a high school teacher in DC for about 4 years. And so I just have a love of teaching, and I love doing these webinars. So thank you once again for joining us today. Let's go ahead and get started because we have a lot to cover and never enough time, I feel like. So let's go ahead and start. We're going to go ahead and, like I said, cover navigating shipping and logistics. And this is just an overview of what we're going to cover. So we're going to cover what is required when navigating the shipping and logistics process, right? What do you have to think about? What are some important documents? We're also going to identify the partners involved in the international shipping and transaction and understanding their roles. You should always have some friends. I always say, you're never, exporting alone. You should have a freight forwarder friend and maybe a customs broker or something like that, right? And we're going to really explain their roles in this process. And then we're going to spend some time looking at the international shipping documentation. It's very important. There's quite a few documents you might need to have to actually ship your product and documents that you need to accompany with your product, right? So we're going to just go over those briefly and also talk about how you can go ahead and package your goods for export. Right now, they're getting a little bit more complicated because more and more countries are having more kind of complicated rules regarding, renewable and making sure that, wood is fumigated and all that kind of stuff for, crates and carts and even, kind of shipping materials. So we're going to kind of go over that too to make sure that your stuff is packaged correctly. So let's go ahead and just start with, shipping a product overseas. What to consider when shipping a product overseas, some basic things. So packaging, we're going to go over that. Labeling. Sometimes you're required to put labels on there. Sometimes your partner on the ground might say, please label this way so that it can be identified quickly. And if it needs to be inspected or something, it can. We're going to talk about insurance requirements. Our last webinar was on Incoterms. And so when we talk about insurance, we're going to throw out some of those terms. If you were not on that last webinar, I know that they have a recording. So please go back and ask and see if you can go ahead and kind of cover those Incoterms. But insurance requirements are very important, of course, to make sure that your goods are protected. And then we're going to talk about regulations. Okay, so very good topics to talk about. So what is our goal? Basically, we want to ensure that your product is packaged correctly, so it arrives in good condition, so your buyer is happy. They don't get some kind of surprise package, right? Label correctly to ensure the goods are handled properly, arrive on time and in the right place. And we're going to talk about timing too, because you don't want to be promising buyers you're going to get stuff within a time and it's not going to be realistic, right? So you want to make sure that things are labeled correctly, because sometimes they have to maybe be inspected or they may have to go to a right location or something like that. So we want to make sure that's done properly. You want to also make sure that, your products are documented correctly to meet not only U.S. requirements, which we're going to talk about. You have U.S. export controls you have to think about, But then I think this was another webinar we talked about the first month, foreign import requirements, right? Every country has its own foreign import requirements, and every country is different, or region. Sometimes some regions will get together like the EU and have, some requirements, something like that. So you want to make sure that your product is, documented correctly to meet whatever requirements, US or foreign requirements. And then we want to, of course, make sure that your product is insured against damage, loss, pilferage, means someone's taking it, which is not good, and delay. So, export shipping process overview. So this is kind of common sense, but we're just going to talk about like what is the process to kind of see where we are in the process, right? So, a sales contract between the exporter and importer has happened. You're very happy. You met that buyer. You're excited, and you're ready to do a sales contract. And you're very happy, right? You've done a pro forma invoice. We talked about that before, right? Got the right Incoterm, all that great stuff. So, previous class, watch the previous webinar. So then you're going to prepare your export certifications. We'll talk about that today, and any required documentation, right? Because now you're ready to ship your product off to the buyer. And then we're also going to talk about, filing the electronic filing system, the AES, which is what the federal government for the US requires. So that's kind of the next step, getting all your certification and documentation ready to ship. Then your freight forwarder is your friend. We're going to talk about your friendly freight forwarder. But your freight forwarder should review all the documents, make sure everything is in order. We are not going to talk about money or letters of credit. It's very important with letters and credit and kind of how they mingle with, or any kind of payment mingle with like your shipping process. But your freight forwarder will review all documents, especially if you have a letter of credit or anything like that, to make sure there's no discrepancies, right? Because you don't want discrepancies, which can hinder your payment. Finally, your products are shipped abroad by a carrier. We're going to talk about what kind of carrier, which one's best, that kind of stuff. And then after the shipment, the freight forwarder can route documents to the seller, the buyer, or the paying bank. Usually if there's a letter of credit or something like that, there might be some other kind of paying bank or something, in the mix. But your freight forwarder can send all those documents where they're supposed to go on the other side of the ocean. And then finally, you have arrangements of a customs broker who's on the other side of the ocean. So let's just use Japan for this instance, who will make sure that once those goods arrive overseas, that everything complies with those local kind of rules, right? And then that's where they'll go ahead and pay taxes or duties. And so that's the general process. And so we're kind of starting from kind of this process after the market research, after the product modifications that we talked about, are exploring like, different free trade agreements, after you find that buyer, after you pricing your product correctly, after you send that pro forma invoice and all of that great stuff, this is the process where we're at. We're at now finally shipping that product. Okay. Once again, we've had previous webinars that are great, so please go ahead and look at those if you're able to. So the role of the freight forwarder, very important. The freight forwarder is your friend. Okay, it's very important to have someone who you can maybe trust. Sometimes if it's a smaller product, you might just go, a smaller order, because you might be starting small. You might just go to FedEx, right? FedEx, the shipper, they'll have a freight forwarder kind of built in, and usually have a customs broker built in, right? But if you need to have pricing and quotes and that kind of stuff, because your buyer wants to know quotes for shipping, or if an Incoterm makes you responsible for paying for some of the costs you need to know, you might need to go ahead and have access to a good freight forwarder. So it's an agent that ships cargo to an overseas destination. They are familiar normally with the foreign country's import rules and regulations, but not always, which is why we taught you all how to go ahead and figure out how to find your own foreign import requirements using the FAIRS reports with the USDA, right? Because they may know maybe lumber, but sometimes they don't know food requirements, right? So you want to always double check yourself. They usually know the US government regulations if the government on the other side is going to need some kind of special invoice or something like that. And then they usually know different shipping methods, right? So you'll talk to them like, what's best? Should I ship by air, ship by, boat? And we'll talk about how you can help, the freight forwarder can help you decide. You want to make sure that the freight forwarder is licensed, right? Because if not, you're just paying for a broker, and each broker that touches it, you're just paying extra money. So you want to try to get to a person who's licensed either by the International Air Transport Association to handle air freight. If you're going to use like an air carrier, Most of the larger ones will be. You can just kind of sometimes go directly to them. Or if you're going to, have someone kind of, reserve space for you on a vessel or a boat, you want to make sure that they're actually registered or licensed by the Federal Maritime Commission. Once again, you have other handlers and people who might be able to assist, but if they're not the actual licensed party, then they're just kind of more of a broker or someone like that who you're paying a commission to and not the actual person. So usually you want to deal directly with that licensed person. But let's talk about the freight forwarder. The freight forwarder is your friend, right? You want to go ahead and see if you can find a good one. When we do teach a 12-hour course. We usually have a freight forwarder join us for that course. And so you at least have someone you can kind of talk to. But there's freight forwarders kind of all over. And so, just maybe you want to kind of do a little bit of digging so you can have one you can maybe ask questions to. But they usually assist with preparing price quotations, which are very important for pro forma invoices. We learned that last time, right? So you might need a price quote depending on the Incoterm you use. And so usually you can call up a freight forwarder and they kind of help you with the pricing. That includes like freight costs, port charges. There might be charges at the port, any kind of cost for special documentation. Sometimes they might have to get a special invoice for you, or you might have to do something special, but they can give you the cost of that. You usually can always get insurance from them. We'll talk about insurance a little bit more detail. And also their own fee, usually because they're not free, right? So they'll have that. They also can assist with a variety of a lot of other things. They can assist with recommending with packaging, and we'll talk about that in a second because packaging is getting more and more complicated with more and more regulations, mainly with environmental and everything like that. So if you're kind of confused, your freight forwarder can help you out there. They also can help review letters of credit, commercial invoices, and packing lists. Letters of credits can be tricky. Hopefully we'll come back and teach another course on the payment options, but they can be kind of tricky, right? Because there can be discrepancies, especially with like the timing of like your shipment. If you promise through a letter of credit that you're going to get it done, there by this date, it doesn't happen. The freight forwarder can say, oh, this is not realistic, take this out. So the freight forwarder is very helpful with kind of looking at those things. They can reserve a space on board an ocean vessel, which is very helpful. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but you can call them up and they can go ahead and just scour and see what's available and the pricing of it and actually book it for you. They also arrange with customs brokers to ensure compliance with customs regulations. Normally, we'll see in a second, the customs brokers are kind of built into the bigger ones, like FedEx will have their own customs brokers on the ground. You don't have to now kind of find another one. But they're usually able to go ahead and kind of work that process for you to make sure that you have a smooth transition all the way from you shipping your product to when it's landing on the ground. They can prepare a bill of lading and special documents. We'll look at those later, the actual documents. And they can help you, get good ship within a specific time frame and tell you if the time frame is not realistic, right? That sometimes is very, very, very important whether you're going to disappoint your client or not, or buyer, right? Whether if you talk about certain time frames. And then warehousing. Sometimes you have to ship it a little bit earlier and it has to be housed somewhere. So they usually can find warehousing for you. And finally, they can forward all documents directly to a customer or bank or something like that after the shipment, which is very important. We'll do another class on payment one time, I'm quite sure, but that's very important when you're talking about getting paid. So, role of the customs broker, they are licensed to transact on a company's behalf, but they are very limited because they're on the other side of the ocean, right? The customs broker is always on the ground, the other side. So really, they're very limited to once you have the freight forwarder to kind of help you ship that good abroad, they're sitting there on the other side to help that it's admissible, right? You get your good inside the foreign country, let's say in Japan, they're kind of sitting there waiting, okay? They also will help the classification and valuation of goods. You also know about HS code. You'll usually have one that's standardized, but if there's any questions about it, whether the right code is used, they'll kind of help with that. And then you use that code with the duties and payment of taxes, right? And so they'll kind of take care of that on that side, right? And they'll go ahead and collect those taxes. Usually those are paid by the importer and not you. And we talked about that a little bit later. We'll talk about that a little bit more today, but you want to go ahead and make sure you have a customs broker. Like I said, many freight forwarders and logistics company, almost all the larger ones have this service built in, right? So you don't have to really be like, oh, I use FedEx, so I got to find a customs broker. No, they have someone on the ground who's going to do this. Sometimes though, and we find this more and more often, You have a buyer who's very particular and they want you to use their customs broker because their customs broker, they know the people on the ground, they know how to spot your product, they know how to make sure if you have to get an inspection or something, they know how to get it done really fast. So sometimes they'll say, look, I know you have your own custom broker or your FedEx says, but I need you to use mine because if you don't use mine, mine knows exactly the process for our product or whatever, use mine. If that's the case, you might have to go to a smaller freight forwarder because usually the big ones will use their internal ones, but the smaller ones are a little more flexible. And if you request another, or your buyer requests another customs broker who's more favorable to them, especially some ports can be, a little more interesting probably. And, with all the taxes and duties and stuff and want to get the product out, then sometimes your buyer may request a special customs brokers use one that they trust, they're familiar with. And so if that's the case, you might have to go to it with a smaller freight forwarder. But freight forwarders, you can just Google, there's a lot of them, but some of the larger ones are just the shipping companies that you know. So let's talk about packaging. Packaging before is like kind of no big deal because, especially if you have like a shelf stable product. Of course, if you have, one that needs refrigeration or something like that, a little bit more concerned, but make sure that you're packaging your product properly. And also you need to think about the distance, right? If your package is just going to go, a quick, plane ride, not that bad. But if it's going to go by a seat, it's going to take weeks or several days to get there, in crazy conditions. You want to make sure that you're thinking about that. So key considerations, you don't want anything to be broken, or, spoiled, of course, moisture, you need to think about that. Of course, excess weight, because excess weight may also, of course, equal to excess fees. And then that can be very important. And then, you want to think about things like pilferage or anything like that. So let's go ahead and see. No, if your buyer's often familiar with the port systems and can specify packaging requirements, they can kind of say, oh, I know you need this or that. So once again, the freight forwarder is your friend as far as packaging if you're not really sure. And the buyer is your friend because usually you are not their first product from the US, right? They've done this before. And so they'll kind of be able to kind of guide you. And they usually should know their own, personal specifications too. If you don't have anybody kind of guiding you, you want to use the following guidelines. They're pretty basic though. Package strong containers that are adequately sealed and filled, not have things kind of moving around in your container or your box. Weight should be evenly distributed to provide proper bracing in the container. If you have it in a container, if you're going to put goods on pallets, make sure that you place them in pallets if you're going to put them in containers. You want to make packages and packing filler out of moisture resistant materials. Of course, normally, if you go to FedEx or have a freight forwarder, they'll kind of help you with this, but you want to think about this because you want to make sure that your product arrives correctly. If you have a problem with pilferage, usually you won't unless you maybe have some caviar or something. But, sometimes, your buyer will let you know to say, hey, don't write certain things on the outside of the packaging because people will start pilfering it, so talk to your buyer about that. And then sometimes you want to use, strap seals, shrink wrap. But once again, your freight forwarder can help you with that. Is very, very important nowadays. I can't stress this enough. I mean, even in so many countries, these rules change all the time. So you want to check the foreign import requirements, even beyond going ahead and listen to your freight forwarder. Because now every country is having, these issues with wood packaging documentation, making sure there's markings for fumigation and chemical treatment of any kind of wood, if you're using like a pallet or something. And if you don't use the right wood, and if it doesn't have markings, your product's not getting in, right? So that's something that you do want to make sure if you are going to use pallets or if you have any kind of wood packaging that you understand the rules between, fumigation, chemical treatment, and what's allowed for the country you're actually going to, have into. Usually your buyer should know because once again, this is not his or her first rodeo normally. So they should be, kind of really, really abreast on how to get your product in there. If you need special wood packaging, but I mean, I've seen kind of rules change, especially in the last year or so. There are even more rules about this. So, the larger freight forwarders might have some standard packaging. Maybe they just upgrade everything as far as wood, but you definitely want to go ahead and just make sure and have that conversation and double check, right? So just ask your buyer to start at least, and your freight forwarder. So packaging, one of the most popular method, of course, is used when you ship through containers. Containers can be obtained, usually, our carriers can be obtained usually through private leasing companies, or of course, your freight forwarder can just call and they can reserve you, space on the vessel. These container vary in size and material. Sometimes you can get a half container or something like that. And then, of course, you're probably aware, but there you can have refrigerated and liquid bulk containers. So if you have, bulk liquids, or if you have, meat or other products that need to be refrigerated, eggs or anything like that, then usually those are readily available. You just have to contact your freight forwarder and they can help you. Okay. So talking about also packaging, you also definitely want to think about sometimes volume and weight and all those kind of factors factor in with pricing. So your freight forwarder should be able to help you with this, but usually air shipments typically require less packaging than ocean, of course, because it's going to get there quicker. It's not going to be sitting on the boat for forever in some kind of container. And so usually sometimes that can kind of be helpful. But sometimes you want to think about volume with air shipments, make sure that it's not larger than it needs to be. In many instances, the standard domestic packaging is acceptable if the product is durable, but we're dealing with food here, so you always want to double check. In other instances, you can get like high test cardboard or some other kind of like tri-wall boxes are preferable. Your freight forwarder should be able to kind of guide you with this. But the key here is this not only kind of will take up space if you don't package it properly, but it really is cost, right? Transportation costs are determined by volume and weight. And if, there's a different calculation with ships and with air. So sometimes you just really want to make sure because, you don't package it right, you can end up paying more when you don't need to. So something to make sure that you, especially if you've never done this before, you're not sure, you can hire a professional company, the first time around just to kind of see what's best, to try to get your product there safe, but then also cost effective. And if you don't feel like you're too equipped to do it, you can hire someone. Usually your freight forwarder can also help too. Maybe the first time around, you can kind of see how it all supposed to look. And then you can go ahead and just, do it yourself later. Labeling is very important because labeling helps, as you can imagine, on the ground. On the ground, they have thousands of containers, hundreds of thousands of boxes, right? And it has to get to the right person, get to the right place, get to all that kind of stuff. So labeling is important. And then also for labeling, it's important because sometimes, like for a USDA sanitary certificate, they say you must have a label, right? They you must have a label if your product has a certificate, on the outside of your packaging. So sometimes you have regulations that require labels, for your packaging. Sometimes you have like, certifications that require labels. And sometimes your buyer will say, look, make sure you put this symbol on here. So, it's easy access or something like that. So labeling is very important. So you want to consider a few things. So export shipping cartons and containers have specific markings and labels or labeling that meet shipping requirements. Like I said, you want to check your foreign import requirements and then also just ask your buyer. You should always be talking to your buyer. All right. Especially when you're about to ship for the first time. So ask your buyer, ask your freight forwarder, check the foreign import requirements. We taught you how to do that. If you don't know, see the video just to see if there are any shipping requirements or labels you have to put not on your package, right? Like not on your actual food packaging, like, the actual product. There's label requirements for those too, normally, like translation, whatever. But you also want to see if there are labels for your shipping packages, right? It's very important. So also ensuring proper handling if something is fragile or something is, perishable or something like that. Sometimes you want to make those markings very clear. Sometimes if you have, like I said, caviar or something that, the buyer says, look, we need to conceal these contents. Let's not put anything on there or something like that. You want to make sure you know your buyer and talk to your buyer about certain kind of labels. One key thing is, helping receivers identify shipments. So sometimes your buyer or the regulations will have you go ahead and put, once again, some stamps or something like that so that for the receivers on the ground can identify your shipment, especially when you're dealing with perishable items. Sometimes there'll be some markings or stuff you might want to put there. And then finally, ensure compliance with environmental and safety standards. When we talk about wood and making sure they have the right fumigation kind of labels and stuff like that, you want to make sure also that they have the right proper labels. So your overseas buyer, right? The buyer is your friend, the freight forwarder is your friend. They're all your friends. You need to talk to them. Usually your overseas buyer will usually, have specific export markings and then kind of let you know what should be on your cargo for easy identification by receivers. So definitely just double check the rules. So examples of markers on exports, shippers mark, just talk about like the shippers or something like that. The country of origin, sometimes you might be required to put, or your buyer might want you to put that the country of origin is USA. Sometimes you need to put the weight and markings in pounds and kilograms, the number of packages and size of cases. Now you're going to have a packing list, which we're going to talk about, right? Which have like, how many boxes and the weight, but it's very good to put it on your boxes too. So, right away, if this is, one box out of two, and you don't have the 2 box out of 2, you're missing a box, right? So sometimes, that can be helpful, just right off the bat. Handling marks, if you have kind of like any pictorial symbols like this side up or something like that, make sure you have them. One thing is if you're kind of using kind of words and stuff, and this is going to a foreign language, ask your buyer if something needs to be translated, right? Because if it's all in English and everyone down the port speaks something else, that may not be useful. So always, want to talk to your buyer to see if something should actually be changed. The port of entry sometimes may be a requirement, or maybe your buyer will ask you to do it. Labels for hazardous materials, it should not really apply to, our products, but just in case you want to inquire. And then sometimes you might have to put something about ingredients or something like that. So just to be safe, like I said, you want to check the regulations, ask your buyer. Once again, like there's some regulations like the sanitary certificate by the USDA, they require you to slap on a label. You want to make sure you know what labels are required and what labels are preferred by your buyer, right? So very important. So let's talk about modes of transportation. I mean, really, but right now there's basically just 3, right? Because really, I mean, we can't really do space travel and stuff like that. So really determine which mode of transportation, you use is kind of limited. So really just a quick conversation with your freight forwarder will be helpful, and your buyer to meet their expectations. Because if they're expecting something in 2 weeks and you can't get it in 2 weeks, if you choose the wrong mode of transportation, they're going to be disappointed. So land, obviously, you can truck things from the US. It's kind of limited, right? Canada, Mexico, maybe going through Mexico, but you're not going to get to Japan, right? Doing land, right? So, or England doing land. So land is a little kind of limited. Air has its plus and minuses, which we'll see in a second, and then sea. So those are the 3 options, but sometimes you'll do land and air, right? Because you have to truck your product to the airport, or you might do land and sea because you have to truck your product to the sea. But basically there's only 3, and your freight forwarder can help you figure that out. So once again, if you're shipping to Mexico and Canada, you might just do, truck, right? And because it might be slower and less expensive than air freight, as long as your buyer doesn't mind. If you're using sea vessels, there could be additional costs because once again, you always have to truck your product over to the dock, and it might come much later, right? And you say, okay, well, that's my buyer's problem. But if the buyer is going to pay you later till after they receive it, it could be your problem because you won't get the payment until sometimes the shipment arrives. It's a class on payment, but depending on which payment you choose, sometimes the payment happens after the shipment arrives. And then basically you'll be waiting around for your payment too. So you want to think about what type of method you use. Air travel is usually faster and usually limit surface transportation required because there's a lot more airports, right? And seaports are easier to get to. So, but once again, your freight forwarder is your friend, right? And your freight forwarder will help you, weigh the pros, the cons, the costs of the different modes, and can also tell you about how best to pack and for these different modes. So it's very important. So now you're ready, right? Once you decided on the best mode, what you're going to use, and it may be different depending on the country you're shipping to, maybe the product you're shipping, right? So sometimes there's just not one standard answer. We always use air, sometimes it depends on the timeline or whatever. But once you do that and you talk to your freight forwarder, then you can start compiling necessary documents, which we'll talk about. So shipping your product, once again, the handling of transportation is similar for domestic and export orders. You're going to put like export marks, of course. And if you have the export marks, you're going to kind of identify them on the bill of lading. We're going to talk about that document a little bit, but you want to make sure that basically any kind of marks you have it on your papers too. So these marks may show the name of the exporting carrier, the latest allowed arrival date at the port of export, or any other information that you might want to include. They also include instructions, for the inland carrier to notify the international freight forwarder by phone upon arrival. You can put all kind of instructions, and we're going to see that on the shippers instructors list. We're going to see that document in a second, but you just want to make sure that you kind of identify any kind of export marks or any kind of instructions on a piece of paper is very important, and not just talk to your freight forwarder verbally. So once again, carriers, a lot of times they're used or limited for large and bulky shipments if you're going to use a big boat, but you can reserve the space on a carrier or a ship before the actual date. Usually you get a booking contract, your freight forwarder can book that. Now I tell you, last year it was really hard to get a container, a container on a carrier because it was just, so backed up. This year is much better. So last year they would say, oh no, you need to call like 2 months in advance. Now it might be like 2 weeks, but the freight forwarder will be able to tell you, but you definitely don't want to kind of, waste a lot of time. If you have an order, you want to start calling your freight forwarder right away, especially if you think you're going to use a ship. All right. So international shipments are increasingly made on a bill of lading under a multimodal contract. Well, the bill of lading is basically the shipping contract, right? The contract between you and the shipper, like you and FedEx. And usually, you don't have to do separate contracts for each mode of transportation. When they pick up, your good, at your facility, and they take it to the airport, and then they ship it from the airport over to the foreign country. You just don't have to have several contracts. Usually that one contract that you sign, the bill of lading, can be used for all of it, especially if you use a larger freight forwarder. So normally that's the case, and you should be fine. The multimodal transit operator usually takes charge or responsibility for the entire movement of the product from your factory to the final destination. So that's really nice, where you're not like contracting separately. They usually have like one large contract that will handle everything. But once again, you want to think of the cost of the shipment, delivery schedule, and accessibility of the shipped product by the foreign buyer are all factors to consider when shipping internationally. And then also the Incoterm that you use, right? Because the Incoterm determines who's responsible for the payment and also for the liability, remember, and all that great stuff, and the shipping process, right? So some of these things are going to be already spelled out based on the Incoterm you use. Watch the previous webinar if you don't know what I'm talking about. But these are all things you need to really consider. So although air carriers can be most expensive, right? Because, usually if you're going to fly by air, ship by air is going to be more expensive. Their costs can be offset because really you can get there much quicker because you don't have to truck things to a coastal seaport. So you'll have lower domestic costs. And so sometimes it really can kind of balance itself out, and you have quick delivery times. These factors may give you a competitive edge over your competitors. Remember, you're always thinking about competitors. So you want to make sure you get there, within reason, the fastest time you can. Before shipping, you should check with the foreign buyer about the destination of the goods. And this is so important because we hear this problem a lot. Sometimes buyers, so the buyer is your friend, talk to them and make sure you know exactly where you're shipping this product to. Because sometimes, as you know, there are free trade zones or free ports or some kind of free trade mechanism or, area on the ground, and they'll want it shipped to that place, right? So they don't have any import duties, and not to their manufacturing facility. So please make sure you're very clear before you start filling out that documentation. Have a nice conversation with your buyer regarding labels and packaging, but also know exactly where they want this product shipped. Right? Because a lot of times they want it maybe not to their facility unless their facility is large enough. It is a huge free trade zone that covers, their facility. But sometimes they might want a different location than rather than what's maybe the location on their, on their documentation. So let's talk about cargo insurance. Cargo insurance is very important because, of course, you want to be protected because especially, even if you're doing by air, right? Things can happen, but if you're doing by ship, right, and it can take weeks to get over there, you don't know what can happen. So cargo insurance is very important to protect, your product as you're shipping it to the buyer. So The terms of sale are Incoterm, right? Is very important here because the Incoterms determine whether you pay or whether you don't pay. And so please watch that Incoterm webinar if you did not. So, but if the terms of sale or the Incoterm make you responsible for insurance because it's a CIF or CIP term, then you should obtain your own policy or insure the cargo under a freight forwarder's policy for a fee. Usually your freight forwarder will have insurance available, so but if that Incoterm that you all chose, right? It shouldn't just be a surprise. You should choose the Incoterm. So if that Incoterm actually makes you responsible because it's CIF or CIP or something like that, the I means, of course, there's insurance involved that you have to pay for, then you need to make sure you have a policy. But even if the Incoterm makes the foreign buyer responsible, you should not assume that the foreign buyer is going to get it. So you need to make sure you see like an insurance certificate or some documentation, right, that the buyer actually, got the insurance. Okay, so once again, you need to talk to your buyer. But once again, you don't really have to do all this negotiation. Really, if you chose the right Incoterm, you should be okay. If not, then they should be buying. But even if they have to buy, you need to look for proof. So if the buyer neglects to obtain adequate coverage, of course, you can, have damage to the cargo and you can have a financial loss, or they may not have their product. So you want to make sure no matter who is supposed to pay for it, you just make sure that someone has it, right? And that you're covered. So let's talk about just basics of cargo insurance. Usually if you have a shipment by sea, it's covered by marine cargo insurance. And even sometimes if you ship by air, it's also called marine cargo insurance sometimes. But basically, usually whoever you ship from, whatever freight forwarder or even international shipper, they usually always have an insurance option. Once again, determine whether you need to or not based on your Incoterm. So export shipments are usually covered by cargo insurance against loss, damage, not always delay in transit, I must say, because, there's a lot of kind of ways out of that, like act of God or a storm. Of course, they won't cover things like that. So just make sure you really read the coverage to make sure you know what's covered. Like any insurance, you want to carefully also read the fine print because, especially for international insurance, they greatly limit carrier liability, right? So you might think, oh, of course this is covered. It's not, right? Or it may not be. So check with your freight forwarder or your insurance provider, or just read the documentation to really understand what's covered and make sure you and the buyer, especially if the buyer is buying the insurance because of the Incoterm, make sure you get a copy of whatever is covered, right? Because sometimes it's covered differently than what you think about with a domestic coverage. So arrangements of insurance may be either made by the buyer or seller. Usually it's determined by the Incoterm, which we know already. The exporter are usually advised to consult with international insurance carriers or freight forwarders, and they can provide details on cargo insurance. Very simple process. You call your freight forwarder and they can tell you about insurance. They'll be happy to, right? So although sellers and buyers can agree on different components, and different types of coverage, the standard is 110% of CIF. CIF will be the Incoterm, which means cost, insurance, and freight. Okay. Of course, CIF is when you're using a ship. We learned last time. CIP is when you're using any other thing, not a ship. So if you're using like a truck, or if you're using air, you use CIP. And then, if it's CIP, basically that means you have to pay, but they'll do 110% of that cost, right? So not just the cost of your product. They're going to do 110% of the cost of your product, the cost of the insurance, and the cost of the freight. Okay. Just to make sure you're like wholly covered. So just make sure you kind of think about that. So a quick thing about tariffs. I think we talked about tariffs ad nauseum, maybe the first webinar when we talked about free trade agreements. So we're not going to cover it so much. And then also, I think the last one we did or another webinar we did, go back and watch the previous ones. But for tariffs, typically the importer pays the tariffs, right? So normally you, as the seller, you don't usually pay the tariffs unless you chose your own Incoterm, which is DDP, then you pay the tariffs. It's only one. So make sure you don't choose that one. But normally, of course, the buyer pays the tariffs, right? They're on the other side because tariffs are, taxes, assessed by the foreign country. So in Japan, that buyer will pay the tariffs, right? Probably zero because there's a free trade agreement with Japan right now, but I digress. And they're handled by the customs broker. right? So normally you don't have to pay unless you choose the wrong Incoterm. So normally, but as we talked about several times before, because tariffs, port handling fees, and taxes can be very high. I mean, some tariffs can be up to 50% or even higher. And you definitely want to think about tariffs. We talked about this when we talk about pricing your products for export, right? Because they can greatly, affect how your product is being sold on the ground and your product's final cost. So really, we're not talking about pricing your product right now and how tariffs can affect and all that. My whole thing is just understanding how tariffs work in the shipping process. So once that product lands on the ground, then the tariff is actually actually assessed then, and the custom brokers handle that, and your importer or buyer will pay for it. So then once again, just in generic, if you have, of course, high tariffs, then of course, your buyer on the ground, like your ultimate customer, not just your buyer, it can really affect how much you're willing to pay for your product. So I always want to think about tariffs, but it's not you who pay for the tariffs, which we all should know that, but just in case. So let's go ahead and move on. We've kind of talked about the process. We should think about labeling and modes of transportation and all that kind of stuff. I want to move on to export documentation, because not a lot of documentation needed when you export, but there's some documents, right? So I want to give you a quick overview. Have about 15 minutes left, so we're going to fly past this. So details regarding navigating and properly preparing export documentation is what we're going to talk about. These will include your commercial invoices, your pre-shipment inspections, various certificates, export controls, and documents used in the movement of goods. We're going to fly by this really fast. So you should have a freight forwarder as this. A freight forwarder is your friend with export documentation always, right? So documents required depend on the requirements of the U.S. government. And I'm going to say this over and over again, the importing country, because really the more requirements are put on anything with exporting is the requirements of the foreign government, right? Because they want to make sure they control what comes in their country. There's only one requirement, which we're going to talk about, the export controls that the U.S. requires, just one. Everything else we're talking about is really requirements from the foreign government. So you need to make sure you look at the FAIRS report from the USDA for each country you're going to ship to make sure you know their rules. But documentation must be precise. Slight discrepancies or omissions may, of course, prevent exportation and may result in non-payment. And if you have even the wrong invoice, sometimes they can seize your goods. So you want to make sure that you know exactly what you're supposed to ship. A lot of these things will be shipped with your item, right? Sometimes nowadays with some of the certificates, they have electronic certificates. And so you can do things like electronically where you don't have to ship a real certificate, but 9 times out of 10, depending on the country, you'll have to kind of have all these documents going along with your shipment if they're needed. So some documents are subject to precise timelines and may not be honored by a bank or something if there's a letter of credit at the time it's expired. So just think of every document being time sensitive. If you have any questions about this, ask your freight forwarder. But a freight forwarder and customs broker, they're usually familiar with the documents, but I want to stress this because if push comes to shove, they're going to be like, I don't know what you're talking about, because it's not their ultimate responsibility. You are ultimately responsible for the accuracy of the documents. So if a foreign import requirement says you must have this special type of invoice, right? And you didn't know about it, and freight forwarder didn't know about it either. You can't say, oh, the freight forwarder didn't tell me, right? You are definitely always responsible for the accuracy of the documents and what documents are required. So always remember the kinds and number of documentation varies, depend on the destination of the shipment. Once again, because of the foreign import requirements, just want to throw it out there. So commercial invoices, very important. So commercial invoices, we talked about this last time, but after the pro forma invoice is accepted, you have to now prepare the commercial invoice. Usually has a description of goods on the commercial invoice, and this is the real final bill of sale, right? This is a real contract for the goods, right? So this document has to go along with your product, and it has we showed you a copy last time, but really just has the basic information, just like, you're selling your product. And so usually the description must be correspond if you have a letter of credit, and it has to be very precise, and the freight forwarder can kind of help you with that if needed. So the customer needs the commercial invoice since it's often used by custom authorities to assess duties. So you say, well, how do they know how much to charge in duties, right? How do they know how much, my product is worth? Especially with insurance and freight, because a lot of times they'll assess the duties by CIF too, cost, insurance, and freight. Well, they take that commercial invoice and they look at it, and that's how they assess everything, right? So the commercial invoice usually have to go ahead and follow along. In some countries, you need to prepare the invoice in English and in another language. So check the rules and regulations, because if that port authority officer can't read it, you might be in trouble. Your buyer should know that, and always check the rules and regulations. Your freight forwarder can also advise you if a translated copy is necessary. But even if they don't know, you should check, right? And some countries, you need to provide a special commercial invoice, and some kind of regions like CARICOM. If you kind of export to the CARICOM, which is all the Caribbean countries, they have like a block together. You have to have a special CARICOM invoice, right? And 5 copies of it. If not, you have to have your invoice that matches directly with the commercial invoice that they want you to do. So always check the regulations, right? Because it's very, very, very important. Various certificates, very quickly. We talked about this previously. You can check the fair certificate report from the USDA just to double check. But a lot of times you're going to need some kind of certificate, like to ship your product to the UAE. You automatically need a certificate of free sale by the FDA. If your product is shelf stable, and then sometimes you also need some other kind of certificates. You also need a certificate of origin. So make sure you always check the rules. But if you need a certificate, how do they know you got it? Because it goes along with your package, right? And so you'll need to ship these certificates along. So required in some countries for certain types of goods. Like I said, UAE requires a FDA certificate free sale. A lot of countries may require this. Usually if you have like a phytosanitary, which means any kind of like fruit or vegetable has to have a certificate from the USDA, or sanitary, which is meat. Usually you'll have to kind of have your certificate along with your item. So this is very important. Certificates of conformity, that's really for manufactured goods, so we'll just skip over that. Certificate of origin is very important. Usually it's required by countries that have free trade agreements, and usually it's it is really just swears that your product is from the US, right? Or some its origin is from someplace it is supposed to be. Usually you used to have like an official certificate of origin that's provided by a chamber of commerce. This is still the case for UAE, so always check the regulations. But normally for free trade agreements, you just need a simple attestation. We covered this for the first webinar, so go back and check if you're not really familiar with certificates of origin. But if you are required to have a certificate of origin, and that's what the rules say, then it will go along with your shipment, right? And then finally, insurance certificate, right? So if you got insurance, you want to go ahead and make sure that your insurance certificate is there too. Let's go ahead and talk about export controls. It's very, very, very important. The export controls is pretty much the only thing that the U.S. government requires. When I start talking about certificates of origin and origin, and then all the other certificates, phytosanitary, all that is required by the foreign government, right? To go along with your product. But this is the only thing required by the US government. It's called export controls. And you usually have to fill out this electronic export information system online. Your freight forwarder, they all know how to do this, and they can help you. Sometimes they'll do it for you, but you're ultimately responsible. So just double check that they're doing it right. So this is an export declaration used to control exports. And usually this is how they gather all their export statistics. You wonder, how does the US Census Bureau know everything about how I'm shipping? Or, basically they get all this data from this electronic export information system. So usually this EEI must be filed electronically by you, or your freight forwarder can do it, or another third party whom you designate. But no matter what, you are ultimately responsible because it's your product, right? So, no matter who is filling this out for you, you want to make sure that it's filled out properly. It's only required when you ship a single product under a single Schedule B number. Hopefully everyone knows what that means. It's the classification code to the 10th degree number, but I digress. So under a single product that exceeds 2,500. So if you have your initial shipment and it's one type of product, and it's like $500. You normally do not have to fill out this information. But once it hits 2,500, then you need to go ahead and fill out this information. This electronic information must be prepared and submitted for all shipments, regardless of value, if the export license is required, or if it's destined for restricted countries. Okay. So normally you don't have to fill this out at all if it's less than $2,500, right? However, if you ship something that's worth a penny to some places, like let's say Russia, because there's sanctions and embargoes, or any place that's under sanctions and embargoes, then you have to go and fill this out because you're going to need an export license. Or if the product that you're shipping, which should not qualify here at all, has like a military use or dual use, right? Then basically you have to fill out export control. But normally for us, you don't need an export license, and so you should be able to fill this out, and I'll show you what you'll put instead. So usually the way you actually do this document through the EEI, there's something called AES Direct, which allows, that's a system that allows you to file this EEI, which is electronic export information, electronically for free. You can just go online if you need to, but your freight forwarder will know how to do this for you or with you. And the EEI is usually prepared based on another document that has all your information, like the shipper's instructions. We'll go over that in a second. So finding your export license, once again, if you need an export license, that's only if you're shipping to a country that has a sanction, which should be very rare, or you're shipping some kind of product that, can be kind of categorized as military, which is rare. So that should not apply for us. But the government document that authorizes export specific items and specific quantities to a specific destination, then you need an export license. This document may be required for most or all exports, doesn't even matter the price, for some military type items. And then also if there's a country that has sanctions. Normally for our purposes, agriculture or food exports, you'll have an EAR 99 designation. Really, when you see that, that means that, you don't need an export license because you're not shipping to some kind of, sanctioned country, or you don't have a military use. And that's, you're going to see that more often. Okay. And we'll see that in a second in a document. So a few more documents that you're going to see: the export packing list. Very simple. You just have a little bit more information about the domestic packing list, but it's really the packing list. It's just the stuff that's in your boxes, right? So there's no real secret. It'll talk about, it itemizes the material in each package. You'll talk about the type of package, so whether it's a box or crate or drum or carton. And so it'll give information about that. It'll give information about the weight and all that kind of stuff. A lot of times they will use this to calculate the weight of your boxes. It'll kind of also tell you about any markings that your boxes may have. And then once again, the freight forwarder will use this to determine the shipment weight and volume, to make sure that the right cargo is being shipped. So I just have an example of a packing list. So you'll see this as one of the documents that are going to be floating around, of course, with your product when you ship it. Very basic information, your information as a shipper, your buyer's information. And then, if you have a letter of credit, the airway bill, if you have it, your Incoterm that you're going to use, very important. The number of packages, so this is where you put like 1 out of 2. The mode of transportation, very simple stuff. And then this is where you'll put your description, the quantity, the description, the unit, and this is where you put like all your weight and all that kind of stuff, like for each one. And then they calculate the weight at the bottom. So very simple, but this is how they can keep track of the weight of your packages, the size, and the number of packages, so you don't, of course, lose them. So this is a very common document that you'll use in exporting. The other document, which have a couple more minutes. We might go over a little bit, but we're almost done. So are the shipper's instructions. Shipper's instructions are very important. It's almost like the Bible document that covers everything you want stressed about your shipping to the freight forwarder. And if what you say to the freight forwarder is not in the shipping instruction, they never heard it. Like they never heard it. If you say it needs to go to this address, not this one. If you say, well, payment needs to be made to this banker before the products are released. If you say, well, it needs to, have this marking on it, all that stuff. If it's not captured in the shipper's instruction, you didn't say it, right? And so you will see this document, but it really guides this, and you have to take it very seriously. right? Because they're going to be like, I didn't hear that, right? So if you don't really specify. So the shipper's instruction is a very important document. The exporter is responsible for providing your freight forwarder with all the necessary information regarding your shipment. If it's something important like a deadline, a date, a payment, something like that, you got to let that freight forwarder know, and they have to capture it in this document. The more details you provide, the greater the chance will be that your goods will move free of problems. Your freight forwarder can provide you with a commonly used form. And then I just have a sample one for FedEx. We're just going to look at it right now. And then we just have like one more document after this, the bill of lading. But basically, this is what it looks like. This is just a FedEx one, so you'll have the US party, that would be you. And you'll have, of course, and your contact information. You'll have the party that's being shipped to and their contact information, whether they're like a direct consumer, a reseller, or whatever. Your terms of sale, your Incoterm, is very important, right? Your Incoterm should match these, the mode of freight, right? And all that kind of stuff. We know like the CIP, CIF, depends on which one you're choosing. They'll put, your freight, your ocean, your surface freight, whether who's supposed to collect this, is it supposed to be prepaid or paid by a third party? They'll say what kind of things that you give, right? Did you give your commercial invoice, right? Because remember, these things have to come along with your package, right? So did you give them a commercial invoice? Yes. Did you give them a packing list? Yes. Do you have a letter of credit? You don't know, if you do or not, then you put that. Do you have a customs declaration? Do you have a certificate of origin? Do you have any other certificate? So if you have a phytosanitary certificate, a sanitary certificate, all of that. But this is where they put that. If they didn't write it down, you didn't give it to them. Right? So you need to make sure you kind of look at this very carefully. How are the documents? Because we'll talk about payments, hopefully another class, but sometimes whoever gets the documents, right? Whoever has the documents pretty much owns the cargo sometimes. So that's why it's very important. They want to know like who's going to pick up these documents, because, if someone hasn't paid yet and they pick up the documents, then they essentially own it sometimes. And so basically that's how so they want to know like the documents are very, very, very important. Hopefully we'll have another class on payments because it's very important with, payments and documents. But they want to know like who's supposed to pick up the documents. This is very important for payment. Who's going to pick up the cargo? Where is it going to go? Right? Very important. Where's, and then all of this stuff, the port of export, the port of unloading, the country, all this stuff is so important. You get this stuff wrong, you're going to have a lot of trouble, right? Are you requesting insurance? The insurance amount. So this is a very important document. The one last thing I want to show you is very important here because it'll kind of jog your memory about export controls. So here is where you kind of put the description of your goods. And you're going to have your your Schedule B or HS number. You're going to have a quantity, right? Then you're going to have the shipping weight. And this is where they see if you have an export license or you're going to use the EAR 99. Remember I told you, unless your product is either military use, that's what this is, USML, like military use, or unless you're going to an embargo country, not company, then you're going to use that EAR 99 designation. So now you know why, if they use it, your freight forwarder use it, you should know that anyway. If you do need an export license, which means you have a dual use for your product, which should be none of us, or you're going to a country that has sanctions and you'll put that export license in there. Okay. And then the value of at the port, US dollars, and then, the value of the license value, if that's the case. Okay. So this is just from FedEx. This is the shipper's instructions. All of your products are going to have it. So you need to make sure you understand what this document says, the Incoterm, the EAR 99, all this stuff and why is important. Okay. So let's see here. We'll go ahead. Oops. Okay. So the last document I want to talk about is the bill of lading. And we'll talk about that like in 3 minutes, I promise. So the bill of lading is basically the final document. That's the contract really between you and the shipper, right? That's like your contract between you and FedEx, essentially. And sometimes the bill of lading is important, especially depending on what type of payment you're using, like letters of credit or not, or payment in advance, because with some bill of lading, whoever is put on the bill of lading, like as the person who you're shipping the product to, As long as their name is on there and they come and pick up the goods, basically, that's it. They own the goods because you cannot change like basically it's called a non-negotiable bill of lading. That's the most common, right? So let's say I put Chef Morimoto in Tokyo, right? And I put his name down as a person who's going to receive my goods, right? Basically, as long as his name is down, he can come and pick up those goods, even if he hasn't paid, or anything like that. Because if it's non-negotiable, then this bill of lading cannot be given to anyone else. And once you put his name down and the goods ship, then as long as he's there to collect, you cannot control it any other way. Then there's another one that is a negotiable one, which means if you're having a letter of credit or something, if that buyer does not pay, then someone else can come in and they can go ahead and collect the goods. Like the bank can take control of the goods. So there's two types of bill of lading. Really, if you have a letter of credit, hopefully your freight forwarder will help you decide which one you need. But normally the standard one is basically what the one first we're going to talk about. So really it's a contract between the owner of the goods and the carrier. So just like with a domestic shipment, customers generally need the original bill of lading as proof of ownership to take possession, but not if you go ahead and have a non-negotiable, because as long as that person's name is down, they don't need proof, right? They don't need the actual bill of lading. And so they can just go ahead and collect the goods as soon as it's shipped. But for shipments by vessels, there are two types, right? So this does not apply if you're shipping by air, because once you ship by air, that's the airway bill. We'll see in a second. And that is always non-negotiable. So essentially, once you put that person's name and that product ships, then you've lost ownership of that product, right? As long as they're there to collect on the ground, they can collect. In that case, you need to have a prepayment. They should already pay, because honestly, there's no way of kind of pulling it back. But for ships, there are two types of bills of lading. One is a negotiable one, and then one's a straight one, and then one's a negotiable one. So two types. You have the straight bill of lading, which is non-negotiable. So basically, the only person who can kind of get that product is the person whose name you put in there. And as soon as you ship that product off, that person can pick it up on the other side and can actually give ownership without even having the original. They can just show up, show their ID, and then they get it. But for the negotiable one, which is, a shipper's order, they call it, this provides for the delivery of goods to the person named in the bill of lading or anyone else who else is designated, right? So that means this bill of lading, your products can be sold, bought, or traded while the goods are in transit. So let's say Mr. Morioto in Japan, let's say him. Let's say he doesn't want the product anymore and he wants to go ahead and sell it to someone else. He can go ahead and take this bill of lading, he can sell it to someone else. Or let's say, the bank, he decides to default and the bank needs to take, ownership because they had a letter of credit. Then basically they can do that. So it just gives you a lot more options, right? So this is usually needed if you have any kind of letter of credit, you want to go ahead and use a negotiable. Hopefully, like I said, we'll be brought back to talk about payments. They're very important, but your freight forwarder should know. If you start talking about letters of credit, they need to do a negotiable one, because that's the only one you can use with a letter of credit, because that allows the bank to take control of the goods if the buyer defaults. But if you don't have a letter of credit and they've prepaid, hopefully, then you would typically use the straight bill of lading. I just have an example. This is a very simple bill of lading from FedEx. And you can see this is a straight bill of lading, not negotiable. Usually I think this is probably going to be air. And so anyway, via air is going to be straight bill of lading. If you do by shipper, then you have those kind of by ship, you have those options available. But basic bill of lading, you can kind of look at it yourself. I mean, it's the same information always, like the shipper and then the buyer and basically, who's paying and, a description and that kind of stuff. So finally, the airway bill, just to stress what I was just talking about, but when using airway bill, if you're using air, instead of the bill of lading, you'll call it the airway bill. So it's the same exact thing. It's a contract with actually your shipper, your freight forwarder. So airway bills are issued only in non-negotiable form. So that way, if you're shipping via air, then you need to have a prepayment beforehand, right? Because that means once that product is shipped, basically once it lands, without having original bill of lading or original proof of the contract, whoever's listed their name on the contract as, the buyer can pick up the goods, right? So you want to think about that. So as such, you and the bank or anyone else who might have title to the goods, you lose the title to those goods once a shipment commences, which is why shipments, documents, and payments, they're all like a little song and dance, and they're very important to think about. But your freight forwarder is your friend, and they can kind of help you think this through. So most airway bills will also contain a customs declaration form or any kind of, information that might be needed. So I'm going to end it here. Basically, I know that was quite a bit. We covered a lot. We covered about, the process and the people and things to think about with packaging and labeling and export controls and all this documentation used for shipping. I know it's a lot. All these classes are a lot. But if you have any questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat. And if not, then we can go ahead and kind of go. But I do want to stress the other ones were recorded too, the other webinars. And so I do encourage you to go ahead and listen to the prior ones if you have not been able to do so. But that's all I have.